How's it going, guys? It's Richard, and as promised, this is my comparison review style video comparing two-handed crossbows and dual wielding crossbows. The reason that it's a little bit delayed is because I heard about this upcoming changes to the evolution of combat, and I thought it might be best to wait until then to see if there are any changes that have happened to crossbows and anything like that. But it seems that nothing has changed, so I'm going to get on with the video. Just a quick disclaimer. This information is correct as of the 16th of January 2013. But due to the nature of the evolution of combat, there are changes happening all the time. There seem to be every 2 weeks or so there's a change to how stuff works. So some of this information might be incorrect if there has been a patch, but as of right now all this information is correct. In order to give examples throughout this video, I'm going to start off with the mid-level crossbows, which I'm going to go for rune. So we've got the rune 2H crossbow, and then both the rune crossbow and the rune offhand crossbow. It gets a little bit confusing with all these names and all the massive amounts of crossbows now, but it should make sense when I show some images on screen and whatnot. So the main base difference between the two of them, besides the obvious fact that one you use in both hands and one you have in each hand, is that the two-handed crossbow has its own damage modifier, while the single-handed crossbows, the offhand and the main hand crossbow, don't actually have any damage modifier. So all of the damage comes from bolts, while on the two-handed crossbow you get the base damage value and obviously that of the bolts. So in the example of the rune two-handed crossbow, it has a base damage of 662, which when you combine it with your rune bolts, if you're using the best bolts that you can, then that gives you an approximate damage of about 1.1 to 1.2k. It's also worth noting that broad bolts are exactly the same damage as rune bolts, so if you've got the Slayer level, it's much advised to use those because they're a lot cheaper. Also, in addition, your range damage is also increased by your range level. So let's say for example you have 50 range, then on top of the 662 damage, you're going to get that 50 extra damage points for your range level, so it'll be a total of 712 damage overall. Then when we look at the damage of the dual wielding crossbows, you obviously get no base damage as I said before, but you get the bolt damage for the main hand, and on the offhand you get half of the bolt damage. So your offhand is always half as powerful as your main hand. So you get 480 damage for your main hand crossbow and then 240 damage for your offhand crossbow when using rune or broad bolts. So overall that gives you an approximate attack damage of 720, which obviously is considerably less than the two-handed crossbow, but then you've also got to take into attack speed, which is the next thing that I'll be touching on. So when you just look at the damage figures right there, it looks like the two-handed crossbow is a definite winner because its damage is like 400 more, so why would anyone go for the dual wielding? So one thing we haven't taken into consideration yet is the attack speed of the weapons. Now obviously this means that you'll get that damage once every attack phase. Now the two-handed crossbow has an attack speed which is listed as average, which is once every 3.6 seconds or once every 6 game ticks if all the game ticks last the full 600 milliseconds. So when you take into account that attack speed as well as the damage, then you've got to divide the damage by the attack speed, so that's 1122 over the 3.6 seconds, which will give you an approximate damage per second of 311.6666 reoccurring. So that's not, it doesn't actually sound that incredible with the damage at the moment, but this isn't taking into account abilities or anything like that. So now what I want to do is compare that to the dual wielded crossbows. So the attack speed is actually much quicker for these. It's listed as the fastest and it is 2.4 seconds or 4 game ticks if they all last for 600 milliseconds as before. And so if we divide that by the 720, so this 2.4 seconds is the length of time it takes for both bolts to fire. So if we divide that by 720, so if we divide 720 by the 2.4 seconds, that leaves us with a DPS of 325. So straight off it sounds like it's better than the two-handed crossbows, but once again this isn't taking into account abilities or anything like that. So now that we've compared the DPSs, I just want to add one final note, and that is the accuracy of the weapons. Now any weapon of the same level will always, well, nearly always will have the same accuracy, and so in the case of the rune crossbows they all have a consistent accuracy of 702, which means that there's no way to really quantify how good accuracy is, but that is so pretty standard for that level and they are very consistent. So what we can conclude so far in the video is that if you want to use your basic auto attacks, or if you're using momentum, then you're best off using the dual wielded crossbows because they have that little bit of an edge on DPS, and as the accuracy is exactly the same, it's worthwhile using those dual wielded crossbows just for that little bit of extra damage. It's worth noting though that you will burn through a lot more ammo with the dual wielded crossbows at a rate of about 3 times as quickly as if you were using a two-handed crossbow. But obviously that's saying if you're using an Ava's accumulator, or if you just pick up your bolts, that doesn't really make that much of a difference, as you really don't get through bolts very quickly at all, so it's not too much of an issue. But in the situation of using abilities and things, there is one major flaw in the combat system at the moment, and that if you ever hover over the abilities or whatever, it will say like attacks with 157% of weapon damage, or yeah, it does things like that. And the one major issue with this is that it does your main hand weapon. So if you're using the standard rune crossbow, the single-handed one, it will only use that damage rather than both of them combined, which I guess that's a massive flaw in the system. And so if you're using a two-handed crossbow, you have a massive advantage because you've got pretty much double the damage when you're using the abilities. And also because there's the general damage of the two-handed crossbow due to the nature of it being slower and the cooldowns of the abilities, it means that you are better off using the two-handed crossbow for when you're using abilities. So whether if you don't like AFK combat, and if you're actually much more into the sort of interactive thing, you are much better off using the two-handed crossbow. But as I said before, if you're using momentum or just using your standard auto attacks, you are better off using the dual-wielded crossbows. As it's kind of hard to show on screen with like data figures and everything with all the different abilities, I thought it would be best to show sort of a clip of me using the abilities with both of the different setups of weapons and seeing actually how much damage I cause over the same period of time using exactly the same abilities. And yeah, just seeing how much of a difference it actually is. So I'll hop onto that really quickly and you'll be able to see the difference in the hits. So I'll show both of the clips sped up right now, and you can see the difference between the DPS. So as you could see from those recordings, the first one, the two-handed crossbow, was about 10.8k damage, as opposed to the dual-wielded crossbows, which is around 8k damage. So you can see that when using abilities, there is actually a huge difference between the two of them. So if you're going to be doing bossing and you want to use range, definitely use a two-handed crossbow. Obviously, unless you're trying to use shields, then you want to be using a one-handed crossbow, but then you wouldn't have the dual-wield abilities. In terms of momentum though, it seems that dual wielding is that tiny little bit better, so it might be worthwhile taking two crossbows for that situation, but it's entirely up to you for that. There really isn't much in it, but for abilities, definitely go with the two-handed crossbows. I wouldn't be surprised if this gets patched in the future, because it's a bit flawed that it does so much less damage. I think that it's a bit of a shame, because it just completely defeats the point of the dual wielding in the first place. But anyway, that's the end of my little review. I hope that this information has been quite useful to you, and you can use it in game, and hopefully it'll be quite beneficial to you. So thank you very much for watching, and I hope to see you again soon.